The rain had been falling on London since early morning, a persistent gray drizzle that soaked the stone lions of Trafalgar Square and left the Mall glistening like a wet seal. Inside the walls of Buckingham Palace, the world was a different place, a world of warmth, of gilded frames and crackling fires, but also of rigid protocol and ancient rules that no one ever explained, but everyone expected you to know. Corporal James Holloway of the Royal Guards had been awake since 4 that morning. Standing at 6'2" in his polished boots, with a bearskin cap that added another foot to his height, he was a man built to stand still and look intimidating. For 8 years, he had guarded palaces, stood sentry through blazing heat and freezing cold, and learned to stare straight ahead while tourists pinched his bottom and made him jump. Or he was 31 years old, the son of a plumber from Manchester, and he had never spoken a single word to a member of the royal family beyond a formal ma'am or sir. Today was different. Today he had been assigned to interior palace security, a rotation that happened only twice a year for guardsmen who had proven their absolute reliability. His post was a small antechamber adjacent to the White Drawing Room, a space used by the family as a private corridor. His orders were simple: stand at ease but alert, allow passage to family and approved staff only, and under no circumstances speak unless spoken to. The chamber was decorated in soft cream and gold, with a portrait of Queen Victoria as a young woman hanging on the far wall. A fire crackled in the marble hearth, taking the chill off the November morning. Then through the tall windows, James could see the palace gardens stretching toward the misty horizon, the bare trees standing like skeletal guards themselves. He had been standing for 3 hours when he heard the footsteps. Light, quick, determined. The footsteps of someone who knew exactly where they were going and expected the world to make way. James straightened imperceptibly, his eyes fixed on the doorway that led from the family's private apartments. Princess Charlotte of Wales appeared in the archway. She was 9 years old, small for her age, some might say, with her mother's dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her father's thoughtful blue eyes. She wore a navy blue jumper over a white-collared shirt, gray school trousers, and a pair of Wellington boots that were clearly meant for the gardens, not the palace corridors. And in her arms, she carried a scruffy-looking stuffed dog with one button eye missing. Behind her, struggling to keep pace, came a woman James recognized as one of the senior palace aides, a thin, nervous woman in her 50s named Mrs. Albright, who had worked for the household for 30 years and treated every royal child like a ticking bomb. "Princess Charlotte, please," Mrs. Albright was saying, her voice carrying that particular tone of desperation that comes from chasing children through palaces. "Your mother said you must change out of those boots before going to the gardens, and you haven't finished your mathematics worksheet." Charlotte stopped walking and turned to face the aide. Even at 9, there was something formidable in the way she held herself, shoulders back, chin lifted, eyes steady. It was the posture of someone who had been photographed since birth, who had shaken hands with presidents and prime ministers, who understood instinctively that she belonged to a category of human being that most people only saw in magazines. "I finished my worksheet at breakfast," Charlotte said. Her voice was clear and precise, with just a hint of her father's aristocratic diction. "And my boots are perfectly clean. I wiped them on the mat." Mrs. Albright hovered in the doorway, wringing her hands. "Be that as it may, your mother specifically said—" "My mother is in a meeting with the King of the Netherlands," Charlotte interrupted, not rudely, but with the calm certainty of someone stating an unchangeable fact. "She won't be finished for another hour. The gardens will be wet until noon. If I change my boots now, I'll only have to change them again when I come in. That's inefficient." James kept his eyes fixed forward, his breathing steady, his face absolutely neutral. Inside, he was fighting the urge to smile. He had 3 nieces back in Manchester, ages 7 through 11, and he recognized the logic, flawless, reasonable, and entirely designed to get exactly what she wanted. Mrs. Albright clearly recognized it too. She took a step forward, her mouth opening to deliver what would surely be the final word on the matter. And then a man appeared behind her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the unmistakable uniform of a senior palace protection officer, the kind of man who didn't need to announce himself because his presence alone announced everything. James recognized him as Detective Inspector Marcus Webb, and head of the Royalty Protection Command for the Wales family. He was a man with the build of a retired boxer and the eyes of someone who noticed everything and forgot nothing. "Mrs. Albright," Webb said, his voice a low rumble, "the Princess of Wales would like to see you in her office. Immediately." Mrs. Albright's face flickered through several emotions: surprise, suspicion, and finally resignation. She knew an order when she heard one. Without another word to Charlotte, she turned and hurried back the way she had come. Charlotte watched her go, then looked up at Webb. There was no gratitude in her expression, no relief at being rescued from an unpleasant situation. Instead, there was a measuring quality, as if she were filing away information for future use. "Thank you, Detective Inspector," she said politely. Webb nodded once. "Your Highness." Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the maze of corridors as silently as he had appeared. And then Charlotte was alone in the antechamber with James. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Charlotte stood in the middle of the carpet, her stuffed dog clutched to her chest, studying James with an intensity that would have been unnerving in someone twice her age. James stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on a spot on the far wall where the gilt frame of Queen Victoria met the cream wallpaper. He could feel her gaze on him like a physical weight. Finally, she spoke. "You're new." James's training told him to remain silent. His instinct told him that this particular 9-year-old was not the kind of person you could simply ignore. He gave a tiny inclination of his head. Not quite a nod, but an acknowledgement. "I've been here for 8 years, Your Highness," he said quietly, his eyes still forward. "But this is my first rotation inside the private apartments." Charlotte nodded slowly, as if this information matched her own observations. She took a step closer, then another, until she was standing directly in front of him, looking up at his face. From this close, James could see that her eyes were not simply blue. They were a deep, thoughtful gray blue, like the sea before a storm. "You're tall," she observed. "Yes, Your Highness." "Do you like being tall?" James considered the question. It was not one he had ever been asked before. "It has its advantages, Your Highness. I can see over crowds, reach high shelves, that sort of thing." Charlotte considered this. "Papa says being tall is useful for being king. People look up to you literally, so they look up to you figuratively." She frowned slightly. "I'm not sure I understand the difference yet." "Your father is a very wise man, Your Highness." Another long, measuring look. Then Charlotte shifted her stuffed dog to her other arm and extended her free hand toward him. "I'm Charlotte," she said. "What's your name?" James's training screamed at him. Guards did not shake hands with royalty. Guards did not introduce themselves by their first names. Guards stood still and silent and became part of the furniture. That was the job. That was the rule. But Charlotte was looking at him with those steady gray-blue eyes, her hand extended, waiting. And James remembered something his own father had told him years ago when he first joined the army. Sometimes the rules exist to be bent. The trick is knowing when. He looked down at her small hand, then slowly, carefully, he reached out and took it. Her grip was surprisingly firm. "Corporal James Holloway, Your Highness. It's an honor to meet you." Charlotte smiled. A real smile, not the practiced one she used for cameras, and withdrew her hand. James is a good name. It was my great-great-grandfather's name. Well, one of them. He had lots. Yes, Your Highness, King George VI. Charlotte's eyebrows rose slightly. You know your history. I'm a guardsman, Your Highness. We know all the kings and queens. It's part of the training. Like knowing which way to march and when to stand still? Something like that, yes. Charlotte nodded, apparently satisfied with this explanation. She turned and walked toward the window, but her Wellington boots making soft sounds on the Persian carpet. For a moment she stood looking out at the gardens, her reflection ghostly in the rain-streaked glass. I like the rain, she said, almost to herself. Mummy says I'm strange because of it. Everyone else complains, but I think it makes everything clean, new, like the world is starting over. James said nothing. He had returned to his position, eyes forward, breathing steady. But his attention was entirely on the small figure by the window. Charlotte turned back to face him. Do you have children, Corporal Holloway? No, Your Highness, I'm not married. Do you want children? The question was so direct, so utterly unexpected that James nearly laughed. He caught himself just in time. Someday, perhaps. If I'm lucky enough to find the right person. Charlotte nodded thoughtfully. George says I'll have to marry someone I don't know, like royal people always do. But Louis says that's stupid and I should marry whoever I want. Louis is 6. He doesn't know much yet. She paused. Mummy says I can marry anyone I love as long as they're kind. I think that's probably the right answer. It sounds like your mother is very wise, Your Highness. She is. Charlotte's voice was warm with affection. She's the wisest person I know, except maybe Granny. Granny knows everything, but she doesn't always tell you. James understood she meant the Queen, now the Queen Consort, but always Granny to her grandchildren. He had seen the late Queen with her great-grandchildren once at Balmoral, years ago, and the image had stayed with him. The most famous woman in the world, kneeling on the grass to help a toddler pick flowers. The moment stretched between them, comfortable and strange. James was acutely aware that he was having a conversation, a real conversation, with a member of the royal family. It was the kind of thing that simply did not happen. Guards were furniture. Royalty were portraits come to life. The two did not mix. And yet, here they were. Charlotte drifted away from the window and began to examine the room, her fingers trailing over the back of a gilded chair, pausing to study the portrait of Queen Victoria. James watched her from the corner of his eye, marveling at the easy confidence of her movements. She was 9 years old, alone in a palace with a stranger, and she moved like she owned the place, which, he supposed, and in a very real sense, she did. Corporal Holloway, she said suddenly, still looking at the portrait, do you ever get bored, standing here for hours, not moving, not talking? Sometimes, Your Highness. But we're trained to use the time productively. How? Observation, mostly. Watching the room, noticing details, preparing for anything that might happen. Charlotte turned to face him, her expression curious. What do you notice about me? It was a test. James recognized it immediately, the same kind of test his sergeant major used to give recruits, the kind that had no right answer but many wrong ones. He considered his response carefully. I notice that you're very polite, Your Highness. You said please and thank you to Detective Inspector Webb. You asked my name instead of assuming you knew it. You're curious about the world around you. He paused. I also noticed that your stuffed dog is missing an eye, and that you carry him even when you think no one important is watching. Charlotte looked down at the dog in her arms, then back up at James. For a moment, her expression was unreadable. This is Barnaby, she said softly. He's my favorite. I've had him since I was a baby. Granny gave him to me. The old Granny, I mean. The Queen. Her voice caught slightly on the words. She said every princess needs someone to tell secrets to, someone who will never tell. James felt something tighten in his chest. The late queen had died 2 years ago. He remembered standing guard at Windsor during those days of mourning, watching the flowers pile up outside the gates, and seeing the faces of people who felt they had lost a grandmother they never met. "She sounds like she was very wise too, Your Highness." Charlotte nodded, still looking at Barnaby. "She was. I miss her." "I'm sure you do, Your Highness." Another long moment of silence. Then Charlotte lifted her head, and when she spoke again, her voice was different. Firmer, more formal, the voice of a princess addressing a subject. "Corporal Holloway, I'm going to the gardens now. Mrs. Albright will probably come looking for me eventually, but I'd like to have some time alone first. If anyone asks, you haven't seen me. Can you do that?" James hesitated. This was the kind of request that could get him transferred to a desk job in some remote corner of the British Army. Lying about the whereabouts of a royal child was not covered in any training manual he had ever read. But Charlotte was looking at him with those steady eyes, and there was something in them. A loneliness, perhaps, or a need for someone to simply trust her, that reminded him of his own nieces, back home, who sometimes just wanted to be left alone to play in the rain. "I haven't seen you, Your Highness," he said quietly. Charlotte smiled, that real smile again, the one that lit up her whole face. "Thank you, Corporal Holloway. I'll remember that." She turned and walked toward the door that led to the garden corridor, Barnaby tucked under one arm. At the threshold she paused and looked back. "By the way," she said, "you're a very good guard." "My father says the best guards are the ones who know when to follow orders and when to think for themselves. I think he's right." And then she was gone, her footsteps fading into the distance, leaving James alone with the crackling fire and the portrait of Queen Victoria and the strange, warm feeling that he had just witnessed something extraordinary. The afternoon passed in its usual measured pace. James was relieved at 2 o'clock by another guardsman, a young Welshman named Davies, who complained about the rain and asked if anything interesting had happened. James said no. He ate his lunch in the guards' mess, a small room in the basement where the palace's security personnel gathered between shifts. He did not mention Princess Charlotte to anyone. At 4 o'clock he was back on duty, and this time assigned to the corridor outside the King's audience chamber, where Charles was meeting with environmental activists. The shift was uneventful. He stood, he watched, he waited. By 7, he was off duty completely, walking through the rain to the small flat in Pimlico that he shared with 2 other guardsmen. He did not expect to see Charlotte again. Their encounter had been a moment out of time, a small miracle of human connection in a place not known for miracles. He filed it away in his memory, a story to tell his nieces someday, perhaps, or to take out on lonely evenings when the weight of standing still for hours felt particularly heavy. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. The next morning, James was assigned to the same post, the small antechamber adjacent to the white drawing room. He arrived at 7. I took over from the night guard and settled into his familiar stance. The fire had been lit by unseen hands. The rain had stopped, leaving the gardens glistening in pale November sunlight. At 9:30, he heard the footsteps again. This time, Charlotte was not alone. She walked into the antechamber with her mother, Catherine, the Princess of Wales, and James felt his spine stiffen involuntarily. He had seen the princess many times from a distance, at ceremonies, at events, once during a walkabout in Cardiff, but never this close, never in private space. Catherine was dressed simply, dark trousers, a cream sweater, her hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She looked nothing like her photographs, James thought. In photographs, she was beautiful but distant, a figure from a fairy tale. In person, she was real. tired around the eyes, perhaps, but warm, approachable, with a smile that seemed to genuinely reach her face. Charlotte, meanwhile, was practically bouncing with energy. She wore the same Wellington boots as yesterday, paired with a bright yellow raincoat that seemed to capture the sunlight. "Mummy, this is Corporal Holloway," Charlotte announced, gesturing toward James as if introducing a new friend at a party. "I told you about him." James's heart stopped. Told you about him? What exactly had she told? But Catherine was already smiling at him, that famous smile, and extending her hand in a gesture that was so unexpected, James nearly forgot to respond. "Corporal Holloway," she said, her voice warm and melodic. "Charlotte mentioned that you were kind to her yesterday. Thank you for that." James took her hand briefly, careful to make the contact professional and brief. "It was my honor, Your Royal Highness. Princess Charlotte is a delightful young lady." Catherine's smile widened slightly, as if she found something amusing in his formal response. "She can be, yes. She can also be quite a handful, as I'm sure you noticed." She glanced down at her daughter. "Charlotte, what did I tell you about bothering the guards?" "You said they're working, and I shouldn't distract them," Charlotte recited dutifully. But Corporal Holloway wasn't distracted. He was very professional. Catherine's eyebrows rose slightly. "Was he?" "Yes. He told me about observation and noticing details and being productive even when you're standing still." Charlotte looked up at James with undisguised admiration. "He's very good at his job, Mummy." James felt his ears turning red, and he fixed his eyes on the wall and prayed for the floor to open and swallow him whole. But Catherine was laughing, a real laugh, warm and genuine, that seemed to fill the small antechamber with light. "I can see that. Corporal Holloway, I apologize if my daughter has been persistent. She has a habit of adopting people she finds interesting." "No apology necessary, Your Royal Highness. It was a pleasure to meet Princess Charlotte." Catherine nodded, still smiling. "Well, we should let you get back to work. Charlotte, say goodbye." "Goodbye, Corporal Holloway." Charlotte waved at him. Barnaby clutched under her other arm. "Maybe I'll see you again tomorrow." And then they were gone, mother and daughter, walking hand in hand toward the gardens. And James was left alone with the fire and the portrait and the strange, odd, impossible feeling that he had just passed some kind of test he hadn't known he was taking. The days that followed settled into an unexpected pattern. Charlotte appeared in the antechamber almost every morning, sometimes alone, sometimes with one of her brothers, occasionally with her mother or a member of the household staff. She never stayed long, 5 minutes, 10 at most, but she always stopped to speak with James, to ask him questions, to share small pieces of her world. James learned that she hated mathematics but loved history, especially the stories of kings and queens who had done brave or foolish things. He learned that she was teaching herself to play the piano, that she found the lessons boring but loved making up her own songs. He learned that she worried about her grandfather, the king, who worked too hard and didn't sleep enough, and about her father, who sometimes looked sad when he thought no one was watching. In return, James told her about Manchester, about his 3 nieces who were always getting into trouble, about the year he had spent stationed in Cyprus, where the sun was so hot you could fry an egg on the pavement. He told her about his own childhood, growing up in a small house with a big family, learning to share everything and fight for what mattered. Charlotte listened to all of it with the same intense focus she brought to everything, asking questions that were sometimes startlingly perceptive. "Did you miss your family when you were in Cyprus? What's the bravest thing you ever did?" "Do you think it's harder to be a soldier or a princess?" James answered as honestly as he could. Careful never to overstep, always maintaining the careful balance between human connection and professional distance. It was a strange dance, but Charlotte seemed to understand the rules intuitively. She never asked him to do anything improper, never put him in a position where he would have to choose between his duty and their friendship. And it was a friendship, James realized. Somehow, impossibly, the 9-year-old princess and the 31-year-old guardsman had become friends. The other guards noticed, of course. Davies made jokes about James being royal approved. The sergeant major gave him a long, searching look one morning, but said nothing. Even Detective Inspector Webb seemed to watch him more closely, though his expression remained unreadable. James didn't care, but he had stopped caring about what the others thought the day Charlotte had looked up at him with those gray-blue eyes and asked, "Do you think I'll be a good queen someday?" He had answered without thinking, the words coming from somewhere deeper than training or protocol. "I think you'll be an extraordinary queen, Your Highness, because you care about people. You notice them. That's the most important thing a leader can do." Charlotte had nodded slowly, absorbing his words like water into dry soil. Then she had smiled, that real smile, and said, "Thank you, Corporal Holloway. I'll try to remember that." 3 weeks after their first meeting, everything changed. James arrived for his morning shift to find the palace buzzing with unusual activity. Staff hurried through corridors with armloads of flowers, or footmen polished already gleaming surfaces. In the antechamber, the fire had been lit despite the relatively mild weather, and someone had placed fresh roses on the small table beneath Queen Victoria's portrait. "What's happening?" James asked the night guard, a veteran named Thompson who had been at the palace for 20 years. Thompson shrugged. "Some foreign bigwig coming for lunch. One of those European princes, I think. The family's doing the whole formal reception thing."